Well, joining us live from New York is Newsweek Deputy Global Editor Robert Valencia. Robert, so just talk us through why Trump is imposing sanctions on what his administration is branding this troika of tyranny. Is this all about domestic political gain ahead of the midterms, and why now?
Sure. Well, it is important to address what's going on in Latin America, especially with the Chavista government in Venezuela, what's happening in Nicaragua. Those issues are very important, but it is interesting that these sanctions come at a time where the Republicans are having some issue garnering political support, especially in Florida. I don't think there's any coincidence that John Bolton gave this speech in Florida, where you see two Democratic candidates, one for the governor's seat and for Senate, actually going neck and neck with the Republicans in that state. Not to mention, Florida is a battleground state, and it's a very important location when it comes to elections, both for the midterms next week and also for 2020 for the upcoming presidential elections.
So let's talk about the individual countries themselves. OK, let's talk about the individual countries themselves, Robert, because the UN General Assembly has just voted overwhelmingly again for the US to lift its embargo on Cuba. So apart from Israeli support, the US stands very much alone on this, doesn't it?
Well, not just the United States, Israel as well. What I wanted to mention from the previous question is that obviously the message that Bolton gave was to sort of revive the electorate in Miami, particularly comprised of the Cuban Americans, the Venezuelans, and the Nicaraguans living in Miami. Now, to your question, obviously, the sanctions come at a time where the majority of UN member countries reject the blockade, what they call the blockade in Cuba, what we call the embargo here in the United States. So obviously, this sort of brings memories of the Cold War era. Obviously, that's not exactly what Bolton mentioned, but it certainly gives ammunition to these countries to have an anti-American rhetoric, particularly Cuba and Maduro in Venezuela.
And what about Venezuela then? Because there are sanctions already imposed on some individuals, but what impact will this have on a country that's already close to economic collapse?
That's a really good question, and I think the same goes for Cuba. These are just extensions of sanctions that we have already seen. The sanctions against Cuba go directly to military rank and file in Havana. People who have businesses will no longer establish any sort of, any kind of financial ties or any business ties with U.S. citizens. The same goes for Venezuela. People, especially, but the sanctions here are specifically on the fact that the Maduro administration allegedly brought gold from Turkey, at least 23 tons of gold from Ankara. Now, the sanctions don't specifically affect the country. They affect the officials in Venezuela. I think that the administration has been very careful in establishing these sanctions in Venezuela because it will affect the people, not just the government.
Robert, just a brief one before you go. What about Nicaragua? I mean, President Ortega has orchestrated this brutal crackdown against protesters. What will these sanctions mean for him and the country?
Well, I would say the TPS, I mean, it's an interesting relationship between the United States and Nicaragua because while Trump has had a really tough stance on Nicaragua, the president of Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega, has been cooperating with ICE, the entity that is in charge of deporting undocumented immigrants in the United States. So they signed up an agreement a couple of months ago where there will be bringing in Nicaraguan nationals into that country, not to mention that the TPS, the temporary protected status for many Central Americans, is about to expire. So it is unclear how the sanctions will affect Nicaragua, but both the Ortega and the Trump administration have been working closely together to bring the Nicaraguan nationals to the Central American nation.
Robert Valencia, thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera.